was interested in discovering more about the city of Melbourne. Read a number of books and looked into historic documents from bygone days. Melbourne, the capital of Victoria, was regarded as the most populated city in Australia. Located by Port Phillip Bay, a very large harbour, the city is established along the estuary of the Yarra River at the northernmost point of the bay. At the time, the metropolitan area was made up of further 30 municipalities, but is rapidly growing. The city was founded in 1835, 4.5 decades after European settlement. Many people from Launceston, Tasmania, are said to have originally settled there. It was named by the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Richard Burke, in 1835, in honour of the then British Prime Minister, William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne. In 1847, Queen Victoria declared it a city, and it became the capital of the new colony of Victoria. During the gold rush days of 1850s, Melbourne was transformed into one of the world's wealthiest cities. After the Federation was declared in 1901, it became the temporary seat of the new nation until 1927. It is often referred to as the Garden City and considered as the cultural capital of Australia. The Australian film industry produced the world's first feature film in Melbourne, and Australian football, television, the Impressionist art movement, and the Melbourne Shuffle were all children of Victorian culture. Melbourne has become the centre for contemporary and traditional music. At present, the metropolis is home to the world's largest tram network, while Melbourne's airport is the second busiest in Australia, and the Port of Melbourne is the busiest seaport. Melbourne has always been considered the most livable city in the world. My very first few days in Melbourne were remarkable. Somebody else, hearing my story, would either dismiss it as untrue or else consider it as just miserable. For me, it was very educational. I met a number of scholarly people who were living on the streets, for there was no suitable accommodation or finance available to them. They certainly had their reasons, and I abstained from questioning them. Instead, preferred to invite them for a hot drink at one of the open eateries in the city for a friendly chat. Many were surprised that somebody with an accented speech even cared. I believe that just a little talk and willingness to listen to them was a great help and was appreciated. Some people in the past considered my attitude towards others on the streets as stupidity, but becoming stupid like that while helping someone feel that life is worth living and good things could come to those who could wait was very satisfying. I met drunkards and tipplers who were either happy or pretending to be content with their life, and those who would love to change for the better if they were given the opportunity. I came across a few young people who spoke of esoteric sciences and extraterrestrials. There were people who spent lots of time at the old Theosophical Society building in Collins Street. I have met Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and even those carrying sandwich boards, declaring the end of the world being just around the corner. However, although I walked around the corners, I saw no evidence of it. Maybe it was due to Australia being at the end of the world anyway. I have met a number of trannies and homosexuals. I have met prostitutes and many others who were happy to talk with someone willing to listen to them. It was wonderful to hear their stories without being involved in their lifestyles. I also met a few police officers on the beat and spoke about their delicate but dangerous occupation and made some nice friends. Those few nights spent on the city streets were very educational. I did not experience violence, for I knew there were not going to be any violent people around me. I was not going to attract undesired elements to my person. It was not due to the streets being altogether safe, because despite the presence of police, there were still suspicious-looking characters around. There were times when I desperately needed to sleep, and so, having no place to rest my head, I went to a children's playground in the city, near the town hall, and in one of the play pods I rested, getting up in the early hours of the morning and quickly disappearing before the sun rose and the city awakened. Then I would have a meager breakfast before rushing to whatever work was available. Alas, this trend was to continue for a little while, even when I settled in Melbourne permanently, due to unforeseen and undesirable circumstances. Whenever I walked the streets, and almost everywhere, I met someone smiling and greeting me, thus making me feel more at home. I knew that when we smiled, we could make others feel at ease and happy with their experiences. They always smiled back, and the world momentarily became a happier place. That is why I smile when I am with other people. I considered my presence as having a positive influence to bring joy to the world, and believed that if we could let ourselves become beacons of light, laughter, and smiles, our world would become like a paradise without strife. We can all be like the beacons of light, which shines joyfully without expecting anything in return other than a little smile from others. Try this method and see how productive your office becomes, how successful you are, and how real your happiness is. It is like magic. But be cautious, for there are also people who do not understand what a smile means and misinterpret its intent. Unfortunately, my closest belonged to that group, and it is an evidenced reality. I decided to try the Theosophical Society and met a few young and many mature-aged people there. Some were conducting relaxation meditations, others were practicing yoga, others were gathering in the tea rooms for a chat about philosophies of the world, literature, and belief systems. They had a beautiful library and bookstore. However, they were also talking about the likelihood of moving to nearby premises soon. The people I met there were friendly and willing to listen to everybody. They certainly did not force their understanding of life on others. They were not preaching, but accepted all religious teachings in unity, and having discovered that, I decided to make it a study for myself and learn a little more about them, feeling absolutely certain that I was going to develop lasting friendships without any attachments. They were all curious to know where I came from and why I had come to Australia. They asked me about my interests and educational background, thus proving that they were genuinely interested in getting to know me. They invited me back to spend some time with them as long as I wanted in their libraries for a little quietude, or cups of tea and sandwiches. Whenever I was not doing anything, I liked going there for short periods of time. This also made my desire to settle in Melbourne more significant. I was so certain that Melbourne was the right place for me to live. Interestingly, whilst still in Hobart, I was given a couple of Jehovah's Witness brothers' telephone numbers and addresses if I needed urgent accommodation, and was told that they would most certainly help me. I am sure you want to know how wonderfully they have helped me. I think it is a good idea to tell you a little of this anomaly. When I arrived in Melbourne, I decided to try those brothers as advised. I telephoned one and mentioned that their relative in Hobart had given me their number and spoken about me to them. The gentleman I spoke to confirmed that he had conversed with his brother and knew I needed a temporary place to stay for a very short time, as I was intending to bring my wife and child to Melbourne, therefore needing to find suitable accommodation soon. He and his wife, who I could hear in the background, sounded excited and invited me to visit them in the evening after dinner. I hoped they did not understand me wrongly, as if I wanted to stay at their place permanently, or for a few days, because all I wanted was to stay under a roof for one night. After a light meal in the city, I took public transport to their address, which took well over 2 hours. As soon as they opened the door, both husband and wife, speaking at the same time, told me that if I had nowhere else to go, I could just sit or lay in front of their door in the porch to sleep, and nobody, not even their old dog, would bother me, and in the morning I could easily walk to the public transport. After thanking them, I sat in front of their door as they closed it in the gentlest way one can imagine. I suppose their brotherly love was truly expressed. I was expected to be grateful for their generous offer and, as you may have guessed, smiling. After a few minutes, I just got up and went to the bus stop to travel back to the city. On arrival, I contacted the other brother on the telephone. They too were very excited about my arrival and invited me to see them the next evening. I did not tell them anything about the previous brother and his wife with their uniquely generous attitude towards another human being in need. That night I wandered the streets until sunrise, but the next evening the prospect of having a short accommodation like that was a most welcome idea. In the evening I went to the other place, just as they suggested, and my tram trip was not a very long one. I felt extremely tired and sleepy. On my arrival, both husband and wife greeted me warmly and offered me a glass of tap water, which I accepted with many thanks. The lady of the house told me they had 2 young daughters and could not have me in their premises, as that would be against Jehovah's principles. But if I wanted, I could always just lean against their garage door and have at least some sleep. Apparently, a long time ago, her husband had experienced it, and it was very comfortable. They also told me that if I wanted, they could give me a little bed cover to wrap around me, as it would make me feel warm at night. The gentleman showed me where I could sleep properly, as he had tried it before. So I thanked him for their generosity, and promptly put the bed cover over my shoulders, and sat in front of their garage door after wishing them a very good night. After he disappeared indoors, I put the cover, which smelt like an old dog when wet, to one side and made my way silently to take the last tram back to the city. I got myself a cup of strong coffee and went to one of the children's playgrounds to sit in a play pod and closed my eyes to sleep. I woke up completely relaxed in the morning, feeling incredibly hungry. and could not wait for a wholesome breakfast of eggs on toast with a cup of coffee before my dishwashing job, where one had to stand all day long. Maybe I thought this night I will be able to sleep in a proper bed, but I was no longer going to consider the God-loving Jehovah's Witnesses with their God-loving generosities. They obviously believed they were doing the righteous thing by giving me a chance to sleep in front of their doors. When back in Hobart and telling Magda about it, she said she could not believe in such lies I was supposedly making up, ordering me never to talk these things to the brothers concerned. But I did, and in response, I was told that their friends had plenty of room in their houses and were fairly wealthy. In addition to that, when they spoke with them over the phone, they sounded happy to help a brother in need. When the gentleman in Hobart spoke to those two faithful brothers afterwards, he said he was told that they did not want to risk breaking their family's peace. It did not make any sense at all. Maybe they needed to hide something I was not meant to discover. When it was explained, apparently one of them desired to make up for it. How strange. Magda, however, was unbearably distraught and angry with me for talking about it to her brothers, and promptly advised me to be a good Christian and do the right thing by forgiving such an insignificant sin, telling me that she would do the same if it was to accommodate a human being in need. Did she really understand me? Did she know what I was talking about? But I would never make a promise to accommodate someone if I had no spare room for them. Besides, I never accepted the ways of those witnesses, especially after what I had experienced. This was something I could never forget, for that was part of my earliest Melbourneian memories. As I told Magda, they had large and luxurious homes with many rooms, but did not want to be bothered with a stranger they had been introduced to as their brother, but not knowing him, needed to protect their women and daughters against the dangers of temptation. Someone else I contacted over the phone was another witness whose number was also given to me while I was still in Hobart. The voice over the phone told me that it would be better for me to go back to where I came from, or I should apply for emergency housing through the relevant government department. When explaining about my immediate need for accommodation before any permanent housing, the voice kept saying, "Yeah, we have accommodated other brothers too. However, we don't know you." You see, we must be very cautious about strangers, for you might be a criminal or murderer. We don't know you. I answered him plainly that the brother giving his number to me first spoke about it to him. He answered that they had such a conversation, but did not expect whoever I was this early. I did not want to continue with this complete nonsense, and put the telephone down, embarrassingly drying tears from my cheeks. Once again, the witnesses proved themselves to be ambassadors of misery, whereas those others they classified as evil, like the ones practicing theosophy, or members of the Salvation Army, were genuinely charitable and helpful to another human being in need. When I was sleepless, hungry, and thirsty, hopelessly walking the streets, although I spoke to them clearly and honestly, I had no hope in the world of receiving any help from the Jehovah's Witnesses. This is not meant to be prejudicial, but anecdotal evidence, for even now I can declare it in full confidence, because of the experiences of many others who had their share of empty promises they were subjected to by witnesses. I was completely certain that one was never going to get any help or advice from any of them. For any desperate need, I could approach city churches or other religious welfare organizations that lived in the real world, and naturally, the Salvation Army. I also tried the waters by flying to Sydney for short periods of time. It was crowded and a very busy city, but a very beautiful one. It was easier to find temporary jobs and accommodation there, but I was accustomed to staying in Melbourne. There was also a need to discover more about that fabulous city of Sydney in times to come. As long as I had a position and suitable accommodation, I would be content to stay in either of these cities. What I was able to generate in income through part-time jobs, I was helping Magda with her daily expenses and rent in Hobart. It was not ideal leaving her there while spending time in Melbourne, but in Hobart I was going nowhere professionally, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel, so that going interstate for materialistic gain was important. I did not miss the witnesses or my wife's endless nagging about my interests, which she forever classified as evil. It never ceases to amaze me how she considered my professional books or occasionally reading science fiction in that light. During those days, I discovered the existence of a few esoteric books on spirit communication, Nostradamus' prophecies, Theosophy, the Kabbalah, extraterrestrials, and Hindu and Buddhist schools of thought. Imagine how Magda would react. If she knew a little about the early beginnings of the movement she belonged to as a dedicated witness, she would be more knowledgeable about their history and not be superstitious about other spiritually inclined schools of thought. When in Melbourne and conducting my research while staying at a Salvation Army-based accommodation, I discovered the city baths where I could swim or wash myself and live like civilized people. In my spare time, I visited the State Library or Theosophical Society, occasionally attending free lectures, sometimes yoga classes, and meeting a number of interesting people. It was certainly very educational. And if I have been able to provide them with some help by listening to them and occasionally making suggestions in overcoming their little fears or personal concerns, I am very happy. Some exclaimed they had definitely felt something different about me, and there were those who even thought I was the reincarnation of some important master or a guru. I could only listen to their claims as a professional while never trying to encourage anybody to believe in those imaginings, looking into such matters in a more down-to-earth manner. Among all those part-time jobs, there was one occupation I invented which was a most pleasant and satisfying pastime. That is drawing portraits or caricatures of people, like the ones I did at the Pancake Parlor family restaurants. Prior to any of my savings becoming available at the bank, I experienced pennilessness and could not even afford to buy a cup of tea for myself. Bearing this in mind, I went to a benevolent society known as the Smith Family Charities and approached a middle-aged woman dressed in black with a huge amount of makeup on her face, seated leisurely behind the desk. Shyly, I asked her if I may be helped with a 50-cent coin until the following week, when I could return it back. She looked into my eyes, long and unnervingly, deeply, and shrugged her shoulders, saying, "They all do the same thing, these able-bodied young men. You should go and find yourself a job and earn your own money. I wondered what she thought of me. I thanked her and said, "I'm a newcomer to this lovely city. Meeting lovely people like yourself excites me and makes me feel really happy." As I approached the door, she shouted, "Wait!" and threw a 50-cent coin towards me, hitting me on the head. I picked up the money and thanked her again, telling her I was going to return it the following week. The following week I went to her office and handed over $50. She asked me what it was for, and I answered her saying, "Remember the 50 cents you threw at my head last week? As promised, I'm returning it. This is it, with interest. It is for charity, madam. Just put it in your pocket, for obviously you are needier than me." And so saying, I left hastily. There were a number of other people working in that office when I returned what I promised. I hoped yet another lesson was learned, and imagined her eyes water. In reality, however, she probably would not have been stirred. I had never asked for any help like that before, and that occasion was very hard to swallow. And I have never been able to ask for any assistance from any organization or individual since. When there was need, and there have been many such occasions, I simply accepted the challenge, starving and thirsty, but never ever asked for any favors like that again. Believe it or not, I'm still the same today. I suppose I was following the worthy advice given by Maurice Switzer. The surest way to establish your credit is to work yourself into the position of not needing any. Going back to Hobart felt like a short holiday, although I loved to stay there, but at the same time I felt homesick for Melbourne. In that moment I forgot all the miserable times experienced during my early days there. We packed up everything to be shipped to Melbourne, knowing we had a home to go to, for which I had paid the required deposit and a month's rent in advance to secure the accommodation in Brighton, Melbourne. We have once again farewelled our friends, including the Strohbachs. With great enthusiasm, we flew to Melbourne, and from Essendon Airport took a bus to the city centre. All our belongings were to be stored until required. Arriving in Melbourne, and feeling a little peckish, we decided to visit Bourke Street, desirous to enjoy some typical Australian cuisine at one of the department stores. In the canteen, I asked a girl behind the counter to suggest a typically Australian meal, and she told us that the meat pies were very fresh. It was also the Aussie football crowd's choice. We were served our pies with chips, and could not completely finish them, as they were huge. We had them packed, and started walking towards Swanston Street to catch our transport to the real estate agency and obtain the keys to our new address. On the corner of Swanston and Bourke Streets, while waiting for the lights to change, little Annette demanded to eat the rest of her pie, dropped it, looking at it a while, giggled, and shouted, "Ma'am, ma'am, ma'am! Look, Kaka!" Magda did not feel happy about this, and probably a little embarrassed, but noticing a woman laughing about what she heard, and commenting that it really looked like that, started to laugh also. With this light-heartedness, we made our way to the real estate office, to be told that the house was no longer available, despite the documents which had been previously signed. They had made a huge mistake, and could offer us other accommodation for the same rent elsewhere, when it became available in a week's time. We had no time to wait that long, and we had no time to search for accommodation, through another real estate agency. Alarm bells kept ringing loudly and worrying me immensely. Somebody we met in that moment suggested we should visit the Commonwealth Bank branch in Niddry for available accommodation right now. So we took the next tram. We were relieved when we were handed the keys to a small dwelling just behind the bank. It was a small alley of the ancient kind. The dwelling consisted of 2 average-sized rooms, wash basin, small kitchen area, and had no indoor toilet. It was outside, almost next to the door. With some apprehension, we accepted the small dwelling for a short while. On cold winter nights, going out to the toilet would present some concern, and heating the place would be very difficult. But we were going to find a solution. One needed to apply a little ingenuity. In my case, I was happy to be inventive again. We were going to warm the place with an electric heater for a while, and were going to use one of our chairs as a toilet seat by turning it on its side and using lots of newspapers and a potty underneath. I had utilized this method during my camping holidays a long time ago. This accommodation was not going to be permanent, but it would give us time to look around for something better. However, what greatly bothered me was the real estate agent's abusive mannerism and telling us that there was no way we could recover our deposit or the first month's rent I had initially paid. I was certain I could deal with it legally, but felt tired, and all I wanted was to have some peace and rest to contemplate on what the ideal move for us could be. I did not want my family to be miserable, and putting up with legal issues at this time was just too trying. I was going to consider the money paid being lost, and hoped that such a crooked business would close their doors with huge losses soon. After all, are we not living in a world of cause and effect? Soon after, to our surprise, we discovered that this real estate business was no longer there, especially after being in existence for a long time. Personally, I felt happy about it. This statement is not due to me feeling happy for someone else's misery, but it is due to my experience with a company desirous to cheat people, as with the money I paid, and although I produced the documents they initially provided me with, they told me the property was gone, and I could not demand the return of my money. In truth, I did not have the stamina or desire to fight any longer, and felt myself being taken advantage of. I could not be bothered with anything at that time other than immediate housing for my family. We could not accommodate all our goods in our temporary housing, but when we settled in a more suitable place, we would be able to do so. For the time being, we dreamt of better times ahead. I no longer desired to experience the devastating side effects of street dwelling, and under no circumstances was I going to allow my family to experience homelessness. I arrived in Melbourne to improve my living conditions and keep healthy and happy together with my wife and child. With this in mind, I decided to eventually buy my own property somewhere in Victoria. My other hope was to keep away from the harmful side effects of associating with those who considered anyone's undertakings as materialistic, bypassing their right to live decent lives. I continued to paint Australian landscapes for people who were generally interested in buying them. However, I preferred human expressions, portraits, and also had chances to paint photorealistic or contemporary works of art. Amongst those fine works, I have included images of Magda, I discovered that only some suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney were populated by people who really appreciated fine art. It seemed others needed to be educated. Magda felt encouraged to assist me a little, using her abilities in selling. She could be good in convincing people. She had a good experience of going house to house and talking to folk. She wanted to learn some aspects of painting, and I helped her. She preferred using visual aids, although I tried to encourage her to create art as she imagined. But she constantly bombarded me with how unimaginative she was and needed visual aids. I felt it was going to be absolutely fabulous to create much-needed loving unity as a family through this undertaking. I was also so certain that we had been wrongly informed about the Australian welfare system, and therefore, whenever there were no suitable jobs, while waiting for my tutoring engagements, we would have to rely on my artistic prowess. She appeared appeased with the situation, yet preferred to stay home because of the child, as she claimed. Although occasionally we spoke about her possible employment when I could stay home to look after Annette. However, that would be quite unusual for me. Certainly, I could look after the child, cook for the family, and clean the house, but then I contemplated that my staying home and Magda working would be unfair in my eyes. She was not my slave. She was my wife, my partner, and my everything in those days. Years later, I still wonder if she appreciated anything about me. The truth is, I did not desire to appear cold, without feelings, or an incapable person in the eyes of the world, for I have been judged wrongly a little too often.